hashtag, and I'm feeling very jealous. I'm a professor here at the... please don't make me a hashtag. I feel significantly out of control now. That's all part of the National Student Survey feedback. Perhaps we should be assigned our own hashtags by our students, and that would be a way of encouraging good lecturing behaviour. I'm waffling already, and we haven't even started. I'd never get a job at the BBC. My name, as I said, is Professor Leslie Carr. I'm just here to welcome you to the Web Science Institute's distinguished lecture, first distinguished lecture of 2016, and I'm very pleased to welcome our distinguished lecturer and you, our distinguished guests, along with our distinguished PhD students. Today's lecturer is Bill Thompson. Bill, it says here, is a well-known technology journalist, and it's not clear whether he's a journalist of well-known technologies or something different. I'm going for the latter because we hold him in very high esteem here. An advisor to arts and cultural organisations on matters related to digital technologies. He appears weekly on Click on BBC World Service Radio and writes a monthly column for Focus magazine. He is Head of Partnership Development for BBC Archive, a member of the boards of Writers' Centre Norwich, British Sinfonia and the Collections Trust, and a visiting professor at the Royal College of Arts.
I'm a visitor here now as well, when you got me in the door.
We've snuck him in. Congratulations and welcome.
My finest achievement.
I was particularly interested to read in a recent interview with him. Bill was asked to say, what does the BBC do? And he says, the BBC thinks it's a media company, but actually it's an engineering organisation that also makes programmes. And it struck me that I wonder to what extent that's true of the web in general. That we, to what extent is this there was this remarkable technical infrastructure that was created with all of this and seeded into our society to create wonderful things. And to what extent has it just been become an excuse for to distribute Netflix programs to all of us at every hour of the day and night? And if you look at the packet counts, where is all this infrastructure going? Then you might be forgiven for thinking so. BBC iPlayer and other services can also feature as well. However, knowing with his great experience of media, of culture, and of digital technologies, I'm very pleased to welcome Bill Thompson. Thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you. I'm lost. I'm honoured, and thank you for turning out on a Wednesday. Yes. Wednesday evening in Southampton. Yay, Southampton. So, as a dedicated follower of the Church of Steve, I have to take every opportunity to plug my bloody phone into charge. I have speculated in the past that they deliberately designed the iPhone with a crap battery so that Apple users would have to congregate around power outlets at conferences and form a similar community to that of smokers. Yeah. Because it was... Ooh, what happened there? Oh, it's... Of course it's... No, I know what's happened. It's fine. I knocked that, and then it did that, because I plugged the phone in and it synced the photo and it did the thing. I'll never get used to the technology. About 5 or 6 years ago, I did a lecture at Cambridge University, actually it might have been more than that, about the two cultures, because the idea about that the two cultures today are not between the scientific community and the humanities, but between those who know what it is to program and those who don't. So it's not being a programmer, it's just knowing what it is to program, understanding the fundamental basis of the modern economy. And In the audience was someone called Maurice Wilkes, and some of you may not have heard of Maurice, but he built one of the very first computers, the EDSAC at Cambridge in 1949, and it was at the time in his 80s, and it was one of the most intimidating things I'd ever done, because there was somebody in the audience who didn't only know about the stuff, but had actually invented quite a lot of it. I find myself in a similar situation this evening with Ted Nelson. And so I'd just like to say, whatever I may say that Ted may choose to disagree with, he's probably right. But if I'm lucky, I'll get away with it for 5 or 6 years, maybe even a decade, because it often takes us that long to catch up with him. So I'm going to go for it anyway. I called this the open web and its enemies. I've done the Open Library and its enemies and the Open Internet and its enemies, and this is the Web Science lecture, so it seemed like a reasonable thing to do the Open Web and its enemies. But a lot of the thinking really has been going on for about the past 15 years in my head. In 2002, I wrote an essay for The Register. Some of you may know it, an online news magazine, called Damn the Constitution, Why Europe Must Take Back the Web, which was a bit of a rant. You'd find a theme here, a bit of a rant about the way the open web was being destroyed by companies that didn't appreciate its real value and beauty, and in particular the US commercial imperative was damaging our freedom of expression online, and my argument was the only way to get it back was to regulate to put it back, that an unregulated internet was not a sustainable internet, and actually, unlike most people in the United States of America, it seems, I believe that governments are actually quite useful and can do good things, and that appropriate regulation within a market economy can have real value. And I'm pursuing that theme a bit today. But I'm starting from a conversation about open data, and then going to lead into open web, and then lead into web science, and I hope to take you all with me. As many of you may know, and those of you who don't, listen carefully, the open data movement is predicated on a belief that some data needs to be freely available to everyone to use and republish as they wish. So that's without restrictions from copyright or patents or legal mechanisms or technological mechanisms of control. And the open definition, which expresses that, tells us that a piece of data or content is open if anyone of us, is free to use, reuse, and redistribute it, subject only at most to the requirement to attribute or share alike. Okay, so it's quite straightforward. And the open data definition is usually interpreted around the 3 axes of availability and access. So you need to be able to get your hands on it, and it mustn't cost you any more than the cost of reproduction. It needs to be available in a convenient and readable form. No PDFs is generally the way of interpreting that. And it has to be downloadable, modifiable by you. Then there's reuse and redistribution. The data has to be provided under terms that allow you to reuse it, allow you to redistribute it, allow you to mix it with other data sets. And in order for that to happen, it has to be machine readable. Then it also mandates universal participation. Everyone has to be able to use it. Your friends, your enemies, the political parties you disagree with, Donald Trump. You're not allowed to object if the Trump campaign uses your open data to make a specious argument that you wholly disagree with. Because if it's open data, that's fine. You're not allowed to object if someone uses it commercially either. Non-commercial restrictions that will prevent commercial use or restrictions for only certain purposes are simply not allowed if you want to call it open. You can call it something else. This is actually a really high bar. It's a very useful bar because so many releases of data fall over in one or other respect, but they all want to aspire to be open. Okay? It's like virtue or being in a state of grace. Whilst in the confessional, you confess your sins of proprietary formats and non-commercial licenses, and you're absolved by the high priest of the Open Data Institute, but the moment you walk out, you think, well, actually, I don't really like what the Democrats are going to do with my stuff, or I'm worried about this happening. I'll just have a little bit of openness, of closedness. And you cannot be a little bit closed. You are either open or closed. This matters when we start to think about the web generally and the nature of web science, I think, because open data informs a lot of thinking here. the fundamental insight of web science, as I see it, is that the web's a social machine that can be a topic of scientific study. And that idea that it can be the topic of scientific study is really important. Because being able to formulate hypotheses, make and test predictions, refine theories, and then in turn explain, predict, and influence the system is absolutely important. The idea that we can apply some of the models of scientific endeavour to this emerging social system, and that we might find our way to interact with this hybrid system that is human and technological components, is to me one of the great breakthroughs, if you like, of the last 10 years. It's a really important way of thinking about what's going on here. And exploring the ethnography of the web, seeking a clear way to explain some of the emergent behaviours, even if there are things we'll never be able to fully anticipate, has become vitally important, not just to understanding the web, obviously, but to understanding society as a whole. Because the web is now a fundamental part of our broader societal infrastructure. And that's not just here in the privileged West, where we can afford our smartphones and our high-speed internet connections and things like that. Everyone's life is touched by the things the web makes possible, even if you never pick up a phone, even if you never yourself use an internet connection. The ways in which you live, the patterns of your life, are shaped by the affordances of this infrastructure. And looking at the web as a whole, I'm interested in the open web, the collection of resources fully accessible through URIs that can be conformant with web standards, that are dereferenceable, that lead you to open data. Because the open web embodies the open definition in its practice. The open web is available and accessible, open to everyone who cares to look. It offers services that can be freely shared. It is, we know, we acknowledge, a subset of it all, but it's become one of the facilitators of an open society. And that's the real point of doing it. Like other open institutions, however, the open web is under threat, just as liberal humanism is under threat in a world increasingly shaped by theocracies and market fundamentalism, the two forces that would restrict our freedom not just to do, but to think, to speak, to challenge, to ask questions. Because if open data sits at the core of the open society and the open data society, and if an open web is the communications medium that's necessary for the creation and continued survival of that society, we can ask ourselves what web science has to contribute to an understanding of the broader issue of the open society. And Open Data Society, as you will all be aware, is my play on Karl Popper's formulation from his 1945 book. So the Open Society and its enemies was written during the Second World War, first published in 1945. And Popper used the term open society not to describe a political system, but to describe an approach to what a society considered possible or thinkable or knowable. It was an epistemological, not a political question for him. To Popper, an open society is one that's open to challenge and open to different points of view. So instead of being grounded in unchallengeable authority, whether that's religiously derived or imposed by a political philosophy, you can ask the question, you can seek the answers, and those answers can be listened to. Now, it derives from his own philosophical work on the nature of knowledge and the nature of scientific exploration. It derives from his own theory of knowledge. If knowledge is provisional, if knowledge is fallible, then society must be open to alternative points of view because the facts on which it is based could be wrong. If you have the model of science as falsification rather than verification, then you're inevitably drawn to a political system in which anything must be challengeable. And the problem was that the cultural and religious pluralism that would engender within a society threatens the fundamentalists, whether they are religious fundamentalists or political fundamentalists or market fundamentalists. It threatens those whose power and ability to control is grounded in asserting one view of reality and sticking to that view of reality, where only certain forms of intellectual exploration are permissible, like, for example, the Catholic Church. Now, when he wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, Popper was very strongly of the view that the social sciences at the time had failed to grasp the nature of fascism and communism, the two big problems, political problems facing the world in 1930 and 40, because they couldn't understand how those types of societies viewed the world, how they constructed knowledge. And his argument was quite simply that totalitarianism forced knowledge to become political, and that in its own, that by itself made critical thinking impossible and led to the destruction of knowledge. So in the book, if you read it, he's incredibly critical of philosophers, Plato, Hegel, Marx, others, who he thought had actually laid the framework for that totalitarianism through their inability to understand the real significance of the freedom to challenge any proposition, that there were philosophers had not properly understood the power that was inherent in their theories and the power that gave to politicians and the military and the church and others who would limit people's freedom to express themselves. That was in the 1940s, and Popper's theories have been with us for a long time. I think they still have contemporary relevance because now, as we live in the age of electronics, we can read them in a slightly different way. This is not the age of the internet. This is not a digital age. I don't like the term. But it is an age of electronics. Many aspects of our daily lives are shaped, for good or bad, by the capabilities of machines that rely on the flow and detection of tiny electric currents and the opening and closing of silicon-based switches. The things these technologies can do, we will all accept, are truly astonishing, and their application has, as I mentioned, transformed everyone's life. The infrastructure of our society, the nervous system of the world, relies on these electronic systems and the ability to communicate with each other so effectively. The telecommunications infrastructure, the devices sitting at the end of it, the nodes on the network, make many things possible. The result of that means that conversations around openness and the nature of knowledge have to be closely linked to conversations about technology. The mobile phone, the computer, the internet, these things have become one of the principal methods of communication, the channels through which ideas of openness have permeated the world. We have built something which allows the easy transmission of information and allows questions to be asked and answers to be sought, and it is being used appropriately. It's hard also to imagine the thinking about open data and the open society having the impact it has had without easy access to a channel that provides those communications. The internet has made it possible for open data to have the impact it has had because we can move the open data around. The questions about the open society have permeated, have become significant because the internet reaches into all areas of our lives, and because we see people attempting to assert control over that network. Now, the net is a channel. The internet moves data around. The web is the social medium, the social machine that uses that channel to transform the forms of society that are available to us. And taken together, the open data movement, the internet as an open network, and the web have the potential to transform society going forward. They lead on to many possibilities. Because the types of knowledge that open data makes possible, and which an open internet makes shareable, and which an open web makes accessible, support the very sorts of open society that Popper was concerned with many years ago. So my argument is that any society that fully embraces open data and open knowledge would find it difficult to be closed in the Popperian sense. That if we take the move towards open data seriously, and if we work to keep the web and the internet open fully, then it would be very difficult to build a closed society or a non-open society. That doesn't mean it would be necessarily good. but it does mean it would be open. An open data society could be evil, but it would be very hard for it to be closed and remain closed. So I'm not saying here that it is necessarily a better way of living. I'm saying that it would be an open society in which questions could be asked, challenges could be posed. And my view is that would make it less likely to be stable. That we would not have to imagine the future as a boot stamping on a human face forever, because at some point the person with the boot would question what they were doing. I remain an optimist about human nature and about the evil we will do to each other, even at my age. I'll never give up on that. So, where does that take us? Well, an open data society is what happens when Popper's vision of the open society meets the internet and the web. The emergence of an open data society is not, however, guaranteed. We've seen resistance to open data and the open data movement. We've seen resistance to the nature of the web and the open web. Many players in this complex information society of ours have an investment in closed data, closed networks, and closed thinking. And they are frightened. Because one way of looking at what's happened over the past 30 years or so, since I first used the internet in 1984, so it started in 83. So you've got 30 years or so of experiment going on. And the open data society that's emerged is an experiment that's happening because we did not anticipate the consequences of the global adoption of a set of technologies that were actually very hard to control, TCP/IP. Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn put them out there. They did not have within them the mechanisms to monitor, survey, control, manage. And we started building on them really, really quickly and never got round to retrofitting those characteristics. As a result, we've had quite a long time in which to observe what happens when an open technology infects the world. They've given us today's network and they continue to develop. The problem is that that experiment comes with certain risks. As with any large-scale experiment where you have unreleased chemicals, or in this case, data and technology, it is very hard to anticipate the consequences. We see them in our daily lives, in spam and malware and advertising bots and all the other aspects of online life that can make things so difficult. We also see it in the attempts that are being made to use the network against us by state actors, by government, by commercial organizations. I remain optimistic that we have within our grasp at the moment, though, a real chance to build social structures on top of the assumptions of openness that will be stable enough to survive, that will be worth fighting for, or worth campaigning for, and worth seeking to maintain. And we may be on the verge of finding ways to work with the network in our lives and the web in our lives that are as important as the point where the Enlightenment replaced the religious catechism with the results of scientific investigation 500 years ago. That there is a possibility for transformation in how we engage with each other due to the availability of information, and we should take advantage of it. Of course, it doesn't mean that we necessarily predict how the technology will develop. And this is where the issues around web science start to become important. Popper, back to Popper, argued against the idea of historicism. He argued against the idea there was a flow to history, that there were core beliefs that could not be challenged. Indeed, the fundamental premises of his thinking were that everything could be challenged. And the idea that anything should be considered inevitable, as in Marx, was anathema to him. Because if it's inevitable, if there is no possibility of free will, then there is no point in challenging the orthodoxy, challenging the hierarchy. It all has to be fluid and subject to change, and that means it must necessarily be unpredictable, or chaotic in the mathematical sense, or it's not worth doing. You ask somebody, why do you believe in free will? The answer is, well, yes, I have to. In order to maintain the quality of life. So if that's the case, then we need to avoid technological essentialism. We also need to accept that a program or a data set or a technology has no essential values and no essential qualities, but those we bring to it. Every now and then I go and visit Wittgenstein's grave. And sometimes I have sit down there and have a sandwich. Yeah, put my sandwich on it. It turns it into a table, or not. You know? Asking what is this data for is as difficult as asking what is a table. At what point does something become a table? It's its method of use. The data is for the things we use it for and can only be for those things. And it has no... Let me step back slightly. The human beings who create the data set, who put it out there, who make use of it, bring a set of values to that process. But my argument would be that if we are thinking seriously about what an open data society looks like, then we have to accept that those values are not inherent in the data and do not have to be transmitted with it. And we need to let go of that belief so that we can move forward. And the radical nature of the open data movement is that. It's saying it's not your data. When somebody asked William Golding what happened at the end of The Spire, he said, I don't know. He'd written the book. He did not know what happened afterwards. It was not down to him to decide. When someone asked David Bowie what was going on in the Bewley Brothers, he said, I have no idea what the person who wrote that was thinking about at the time. That's something we understand. The whole philosophy of the death of the author in art is something we live with. And yet we believe data has inherent qualities. That's not an argument to go away from looking to see what the motives of the person who created it were, or whether the institution has distorted it in some way. The whole of climate science is based on trying to understand why people collected certain data in certain ways. But it doesn't infect the actual data or the other uses we can make of it. If we accept that, then we can see that open data is a tool through which really radical political power can be exercised. Because the freedom that comes with having the data and being unencumbered with any assumptions about what it means or how it should be used allow you to use it for anything you want to use it for. And that's a power that can be exercised in various traditional or non-traditional ways. And it also defines a contested zone where real politics is done. The open web, where this data is made accessible, is a zone of engagement within which civil society congregates, like Tiananmen Square in 1994 or Tahrir Square in 2011. And it permits forms of action which challenge authority. And that political sensibility needs to be more fully acknowledged in our conversations. It's not there, it's just not there enough. Now, we can't simply pull down the walls to the flow of data, make data move unimpeded around the net and expect no consequences. And again, we know that technology does not exist within a vacuum. The growing use of powerful digital computers connected by that faster and even more pervasive network creates a reality with which we have to engage. And the vast amounts of structured data that can be accessed through that network and processed by those computers requires us to ask hard questions about the ways we want to use it to shape society. And here we have the problem, because observation would seem to indicate, roughly, that the legal, the regulatory, the political, the financial, and the social frameworks that define modern society are not amenable to the emergence of a working open data society. That the blocks in the way of that are simply enormous. Openness is fragile. Open data, doubly so. The open web, the things that the open society would offer will always be under challenge from those who would seek to lock down APIs, impose rigid ideologies, assert copyright to the max, limit the freedom to use, reuse, distribute, understand, interpret, act on the basis of that data. Of course, partly that's because you have many businesses whose entire business model relies on limiting people's ability to copy and modify, whether that's songs or images or video. The content industries find it very hard to cope with the forms of openness I'm talking about because they have value, they have IP in this material. But there are also non-commercial reasons. Doctors who keep medical records confidential, companies storing personal emails, those who make money by marshalling academic papers. There can be good reasons to limit access. And it becomes hard to draw the boundary to say where the benefits of openness will be greater because they are by and large unproven versus the existing, sometimes very rigid structures that limit our freedom to do things. And that's the conflict that we are all aware of, the one that lies at the heart of the open data society and creates enemies of the open web. It's not actually a technological issue. It will not be solved by technology. It is, at its core, back to Popper, an issue of epistemology, a question of how we know the world, and a question that then comes before we ask how the knowledge can be applied and used. If we are to interpret what's happening on the web in a form that allows us to begin to understand, control, direct, predict, theorize, influence it, then we have to deal with it. If we want to live in an open data society, then we have to build it. And if we want an open web, we have to build it too. At the moment, we have the remnants of an open web. A good friend of mine, Hussein Direction, is Iranian, and about 8 or 9 years ago, he blogged a lot. He blogged in both English and Farsi. And then, unfortunately, he was locked up by the Iranian secret police, and he was in prison for 6 years. He'd been sentenced to 17 years. They let him out early. And he came back to the internet and said, "What have you done? Why have you broken the web? What happened? What's this Facebook thing? Why have you taken the beautiful open web that I used to work on, where everyone had a voice and it was easy to publish and we linked to each other and were kind and generous, and built all of these silos and broken all the links and made sharing next to impossible?" He then published his essay on Medium. He understood the irony, but also on his own blog. And it had some impact. It was in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago as well. And it's this question now, if you'd been away for 10 years and came back to see what we have done with the net today, would you be shocked or pleased? Well, it's so much faster, and the colours are so much brighter, but, it doesn't actually work in the same way. And that, of course, is the eternal conflict between the two parts of Stuart Brand's famous epithet. So most people know information wants to be free. They don't know the full quote. On the one hand, information wants to be expensive because it's so valuable. The right information in the right place just changes your life. On the other hand, information wants to be free because the cost of getting it out is getting lower and lower all the time. So you have these two fighting against each other. 1984, Steve Brand talking to Steve Wozniak. Sorry, Stuart Brand talking to Steve Wozniak. Yeah, information doesn't want to be free. Actually, Brand was wrong. He's so wrong it's impossible. Information doesn't want anything. It's not a thing. It doesn't have values. It doesn't have consciousness. It doesn't have an agent or a representative or a desire. It doesn't sit in front of me listening. But how we think about information becomes important. How we think about the movement of data, how we think about its acquisition, its sharing, its openness, is becoming a core political issue. If we think about the open web as the expression of, the extension of liberal society to an IP-based world, then we can begin to see why so many actors are suspicious of it. The government, commercial actors, rights holders, theocrats of every faith, censors, and of course fascists of every political persuasion are worried by the things that open data shared over an open internet into an open web offers the world, because it offers, as Barack Obama would say, hope. And that hope is something we need to build on. A lot of people have a lot of reasons to limit our online freedom and to restrict creative or challenging uses of the web. They seek to monitor and thereby control the flow of ideas And in an academic institution like that, that should be anathema. They seek to limit topics of debate or creative expression and political activities, all things which the open web necessarily supports. Because being open means you don't stop. You are not allowed to stop people doing this. The permission they are granted extends beyond the desire of the person granting it. And hence, openness emerges, challenges emerge, and we build, I hope, a better world. Now, science and politics, technology and politics, are inextricably linked, but in general, only the politicians are comfortable with this. That's why they exploit us all so effectively, because they've realised this and they're happy with it, whereas when we realise it, we're unhappy with it and seek to avoid it. We seek to repress the fact that the tools we have built can be used for these purposes, that it is necessary to engage in a dirty political debate with people we might not like or agree with. A politician will use science to justify policy when it is expedient to do so, and they will also ignore that science when it is expedient to do so. A friend of mine was part of the nudge unit in Number 10, attempting to provide evidence-based policy to politicians. And he said to me, in 10 years I observed something. If a politician does not care about a policy, then he or she will listen to the evidence. If he does care about a policy, or she does care about a policy, then it doesn't matter what the evidence is at all. They will not change their mind. Okay? It was the most depressing thing I'd heard. Fortunately, we were talking on a train from London to Cambridge, and we had beer. If I'd known, I would have bought gin, but beer did the job. Because the internet does not care about us or our politics. The web does not care. Information doesn't want anything. What cares are people, the individuals, the scientists, who are seeking to apply the tools of scientific debate and discourse to these very hard problems. And web science is the tool that is currently in our hands to allow us to create, nurture, sustain an open web. But it will only do that if you choose to engage and ask the hard questions. And I do not think you have a choice, because our enemies are already there. The dangerous trend of turning the internet into a zone of military engagement where it has been weaponized and compromised and subverted by the governments and secret services and agents and police forces and military agencies of all the countries has already happened. It is not something they are thinking about doing, it is something they are doing, have done. The net has been weaponized, the web too. Insertion of malware using incredibly sophisticated technologies by the NSA is a known thing. They do it all the time. They probably compromised most of your computers. They certainly compromised mine because of the people I hang out with. I'd like you all now to just shout into my phone, "Hello, Rick." Could we have that? Hello, Rick. Thank you, okay. That's Rick Ledgett, who's the Deputy Director of the National Security Agency. I had the privilege of having supper with him a few weeks ago. I can't believe they're not now listening in, okay? So I'd just like to say hi every now and then so that he's aware. And so thank you all for participating in that act of treason. Not only do we know who you are, we know where you are, and we know the IMEI numbers of all of your phones, so we're fine. How do we get around that? Well, the tool that is available to us is the identification and labelling of speaking truth to power. We can find out what's going on. We can use the mechanisms that have been developed to analyse traffic to look for anomalies. If all goes well, tomorrow or the day after, the discovery of gravitational waves will be announced. One of the greatest scientific things of this decade so far. The last big prediction from general relativity, we will have found it. That is a really great moment. You find that by looking for anomalies in the cosmic background radiation. Okay, you find weapons on the internet by looking for anomalies in traffic, in the behaviours you're observing, and you don't dismiss them as just being glitches or randomness. You actually look for reasons. Do we need the equivalent of King's College London's Department of War Studies, considering how to observe and make public the military use of the web? Is that something that we should be thinking about doing now, so that it becomes harder and harder to hide these tools? We also need to find ways to say what is good, to define the good uses of the good web, to determine metrics that define a healthy web and use these to monitor its health over time. How do we know what it is for the web to be effective in promoting discourse, in promoting civil society? How do we explore the characteristics of a web that preserves openness, and then figure out which of those attributes are core and must be defended, and which are contingent and can be allowed to go away? How do we think about it in those areas? And I know some people are already thinking about these sorts of things. But underpinning it all has to be a willingness on those who are working in the field of web science to shape policy and to shape the technology. Because if we're going to program the social machine from within, great phrase, I want it on a t-shirt, if we're going to program the social machine from within, we need to know which levers to pull. And we need as well a political program to drive the technical program. We need to do that. Stalin pointed it out many years ago, that once the ideological line has been designed and developed, then it is the practice on the ground that determines its success. So we need to develop an ideology of what a good web looks like, of what an open web looks like, so we know what it is that we are actually trying to defend. And that means bringing in political theory, the ideas of the open society and the open data society, and then considering ways the open web can sustain it. How many social problems can we solve from that perspective? And how can we do it without descending into solutionism? The label Evgeny Morozov has for this idea that you can solve any problem by throwing some technology at it and it will be fine. Build 3G networks in Zambia and the world suddenly becomes a better place until they break and you can't afford to repair them, as Robert was talking about earlier. That is a long process. This is a complicated process. It is a long haul. We've built canals and railways and roads and airports. Ooh, that's my watch. And other things. But we'll only have an open web as we go forward if we do build and defend it. We need to defend it against all of those who see in the open web challenges to their authority. They are right to fear it. We are right to build it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. We are right to build it. Questions, please. I see a hand going up over here from this gentleman behind.
Thanks, Les. You're a good man. Never.
I find your idealization extremely interesting. I don't know about its implementability, but there's one point in particular I would like to argue with, and that is the share-alike license, which I consider to be one of the most toxic and evil things there is, because it defines a closed and hermetic environment where only share-alike contents of the same genesis can be included. Therefore, nothing from public domain, nothing from free usage, nothing paid, only things that are defined in this way. And I don't think that's workable.
I think that is a really good point. Absolutely. There are many issues around the open model and open licenses. Unfortunately, the move to Creative Commons has solidified a lot of thinking when it should have been left more fluid and flexible. I don't know if you worked at all with Creative Commons as they were starting up, but I was working with Larry Lessig and people at the time. And it's a real shame that Creative Commons still exists. It was never meant to. It was meant to demonstrate what could be done by a proper copyright law to promote liberalisation and rethinking of copyright.
But Creative Commons essentially is a way of persuading people to give up their rights in a dignified sort of way, and there's no way to enforce it. So it's more vacuous than people suppose.
That's one point, but for me, the more fundamental point is it was supposed to provoke real substantive change to the underlying law around intellectual property. It never did that. It became the end in itself. So I would not hold to the particular model that they express, and I agree there are many issues about share alike. So I'm not going to fight back, I'm not going to push back on that one. I think you've identified one of the issues that we really need to think hard about.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted. Other questions? Rafa.
I'm not quite sure about the word open. If it relates to open trade and the web as an environment for open data trading, or is for self-organizing system. If it's for a self-organizing system, maybe in an open web, you can have an open communication. In that sense, participants can confront. If they confront, they mainly can expose their weaknesses, their threats,
Yep.
their interests.
Yes. So the argument is not that everything must be open, or that the open web is the only thing that must exist. So spaces for the sorts of engagement you're talking about will also be created, supported, maintained by the technologies we're building. My argument is that there is a danger there will be nothing that is open, that we will lose all of it because it can be so effectively locked down as things currently stand. So I think the different aspects of engagement online, the different forms of data sharing and sort of use should all coexist. So this is not an argument against any particular model of exploitation of the web, except to say that they need to be done in a way that does not threaten the fully open web. Does that help at all? That I'm not saying this is the only way we do it. I'm saying this needs to be, we need to build a system which will at least do this and then see what else happens.
Yeah, yes. But the second part is like you mentioned enemies.
Yes?
But I think enemies are web participants too.
Enemies are friends we just haven't met yet. Yep.
All of them can confront each other within the web.
That would, they can, but there's a massive power imbalance. Yeah, the NSA can do things and has funding that we are not capable of matching. And so the sort of confrontation you're describing will result in our failure. And therefore we need to think about what tools are at our disposal to make it a more equal competition, a more equal conversation. I think that the sort of conflict you are talking about at the moment would end up with the loss of the thing we value. And so we may need a period of time in which we think hard about those issues before we actually take on that particular challenge. But eventually, yes, we have to take it on. You've been waiting for ages. Okay, who's next?
Okay, so we'll do, and then we'll come back.
Yeah, okay.
I guess it's connected to this. I heard a lot about this, for example, the problem of having silos and having Facebook, and I think perhaps there's in this conflict, as you say, there's perhaps a disconnection between what academic or journalists think, because both fields are people who like to share, who want to share.
Yeah.
But I think compared to any of other previous revolutions, the majority of people don't actually, they find the idea that their thoughts and ideas will be spread around the world scary more than interesting. So if you're ever gonna try to fight the powers to have an open web, I think first of all you need to find an alliance with the majority of people, somehow try to persuade them, get them on board. Because it's, I mean, for us it's obvious, but
Yeah.
for most people it's not.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a vanguardist, I suppose, where I think we will all lead a glorious revolution up against the barricades, and then the populace will be so inspired by our sacrifice that they will then take up arms against the oppressive enemies. But I might possibly be channeling too much of the Paris Commune there, and that really didn't end well for them. But no. So, the benefits that come from open data accrue to large numbers of people all the time. Okay? Satellite imagery, transport information, things like that. Okay? They are increasingly being captured by commercial organisations. There's a very good piece by John Patel a couple of days ago, I think it was in The Atlantic, about Waze. The fact that Waze's algorithm that will reroute you around traffic in San Francisco is really good, but it's closed, and so they own the public space and the way people move around it, and they are appropriating it and creating commercial value out of it. And should we allow this to happen? It used to be we had public infrastructure, traffic lights, traffic cops, things like that, which managed the flow of traffic, and we were all equal in that world, or relied on our particular special local knowledge, or being a black cab driver rather than an Uber driver, to be able to get through it. That is breaking down. So benefits come to people, for society as a whole, from openness, and we can start to express that and make people realise why. It's a bit like the arguments for a living wage, or for social security, or national health system. If you can make those arguments.
Very obvious for people to
Well, I would say that the arguments for open data should be as obvious, and I'm looking to all of you to start making them. You're letting us down. It's only your failure that's making the world such an awful place.
Don't forget to tweet that. We'll get our PR people on to it tomorrow.
All right.
Thank you.
So if data is neutral and doesn't have an inherent political value, let's say, yes, it is open to interpretation by everyone. As you demonstrated, you could have opposing political parties with complete different views, but you could also get a complete spectrum between those two interpretations and forms of data or one collection. Do you think it is possible or desirable for us to try and model those interpretations in a machine-readable way? And if so, what would the implications of that be?
Oh, that's nice. So, meta web science. That's good, because frankly, you always need another level of indirection. Roger Needham always says this, And then David Whitehead said, and it just creates a new layer of problem on top, of course. So, but some more interesting problems.
Funding,
And there speaks the professional academic. The answer is yes. As in, if we could begin to attack that issue of how to represent the use within different contexts, then we can, without measurement, there is nothing. Okay, so yes, how would you begin to measure that? And I think that almost I would read it as, rather than thinking about methods of use, it's what values are being ascribed. So what is being imported into this data set that is not inherent in it, and how do we begin to measure that? Because there's quite a lot of sociological work around that sort of thing. So you could start to tap into existing theoretical frameworks, but thinking about it in a web theoretic context. I think it's a really good question.
I'm just wondering whether it might be useful to break down this data, which right now is just very, very big, and come up with a typology or taxonomy to discuss what type of data is usefully open and what kind of data might not should not be open. Because you had issues in your presentation, you mentioned issues of privacy and surveillance. And of course there is a lot of work that is done which can be appropriated and exploited if everything is open.
Yes.
So perhaps if we have a clearer sense that this type of data is very useful for everyone to be accessible, and other types of data. So I think, for example, of questions of academic integrity. So I think every student who thinks it would be very nice to reuse data found and use it in term papers, I'm not so sure whether that is in anyone's interest.
Okay, so the ODI, the Open Data Institute, has done a lot of work trying to separate out ideas of big data, personal data, open data, trying to provide a framework for thinking about it so people don't get frightened. Observation would indicate that those boundaries are so fluid that it may never be sensible to apply them, that basically everything can be personal data in a particular context. And so to have some sort of blanket statement around the use of personal data will get you into the same sort of trouble as saying that everything must automatically be open or everything must be share alike under the same way. That in a sense, I'm looking for nuance here. I'm looking for complexity and then ways to deal with that complexity rather than a taxonomy which will break down. So I'd be much more interested, I think, in 5 years of well-funded exploration of the issue that allows something to be abstracted from that becomes a useful descriptive framework. So I used to make a joke. Actually, okay, I'll make my joke. It's 2 jokes. What's the difference between what do you call alternative medicine that works? Medicine. Good. What do you call a folksonomy that works? Taxonomy. Okay, so we are at the point where we need that massive exploration. We need to entertain lots of possibilities because we're not yet in a position to really be confident about the boundaries. And they may not be the boundaries we think they are. So back to your point about the uses and values that are attributed to the data, maybe harm is one of the things we can start to measure. Was the use of this data harmful to individuals? And that's far more relevant than did they know my address. So it may well be that things start to emerge which help us begin to put meaningful labels on. Back to particle physics. Yeah, quarks do not have colours. They are not strange or charming. Those are random words deliberately designed to make it clear to people that we don't know what these properties are. Electrons don't spin. Okay? So we abstract from the data certain useful predictive things, but it may be possible in the field of web science to give them meaningful labels as opposed to just calling them blue. That's my speculative hypothesis.
Okay. Oh, go on.
I just thought of suggesting an analogy. We were talking about capital earlier.
Yep.
And it feels like there is a strong analogy with capital. I mean, knowledge, data could be capital.
Yeah.
But in the same sense, what you're talking about is, to some extent, private versus public capital. There are, I don't like when people buy gold bathtubs. I don't like it when they pay ridiculous bonuses to people who haven't earned them. But that's the way that private capital, we have a lot of waste in the system, but it's the best system that we know of. But we have exceptions to the capitalist system. We've got universities where you don't have to earn your bread and butter every day. You're trying to get grants, and you have governments which spend money to acquire data to do or provide public good. So you've got different classes of how the data gets formed. And basically, the reason I bring up the analogy is it feels like it's an insoluble problem. We've got the best system that there is, but it doesn't work very well.
Then it's not the best system that it is actually. I think you might find that some of us could imagine other systems. I refer you to the Communist Manifesto. I'm just saying we can imagine alternatives. So the word best is the way you dropped in all your entire value system into that. We have a system which limps along and doesn't seem to be reformable. Will data necessarily fall into that pan? Is that the best we can come up with as imperfect human beings? I would say possibly, but I'm not willing to give up on it yet.
So I'd just like to return you to the statement you made, your friend saying that sort of everything's gone to hell in a handcart in the last 10 years. I just wonder, to what extent, where do you think the problems are? In the sense that I wonder, we could reimagine our governments and we could reimagine our economies, the things that create mega companies like Google and Facebook that concentrate all our data and that create new kinds of ownership and new kinds of territoriality in the markets. we could look at our technologies, but then at a certain level we are just bound by the political geography of our planet, of the fact that when we created international networks, we had to lay the cable somewhere, hence creating pinch points in the physical network that the security services could build into and could create new forms of surveillance just by the fact that we needed some substrate to create this virtual world on.
Yeah.
Are we just completely stuffed from planet Earth, or do we have a way of engineering around these constraints?
Somebody has a beautiful sticker on their computer in my office which said, "It's not the cloud, it's somebody else's computer." And of course, you don't know what's happening in that computer. Similarly with the cables. So I believe you can actually pass laws, make regulations, threaten people with consequences, and force even those who would be bad actors to be good because they fear the consequences. So I think we could set up frameworks. Yeah? If the Director General of the NSA was before the International Criminal Court on war crimes charges, that might possibly deter some of their more aggressive programs. But of course that person is not, because those things are not. However, it used to be that certain acts of barbarism were commonplace. I discovered from reading the novels of Neil Stevenson that the old site of the Guardian newspaper on Farringdon Road was the location of London's Bear Pit and Best Brothel. Long before the Guardian was there, obviously. And there really are too many. Things do get better. We do decide that some forms of behaviour are not acceptable. And what we can do, we have the possibility now to begin to understand the impact on the wider society of the things that are being done in our name and ask for them to stop. But we're 50 years ago, you'd all have been smoking, right? And then some of us would have had a few whiskies and driven our cars home. Okay, neither of those things happens anymore. The world does get better. So I think we can, and I think actually the stuff you are doing, you personally are doing, will give us some of the arguments, because it has to be grounded in the data. We have to make that argument starting now, so we begin to have it. And that political engagement, if it starts now, could change things in 10, 15, 20 years.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So the web, we're only on version 2, web 2.0, perhaps web 3.0. We've got a long way to go yet before it turns into a decent, human, responsible kind of environment for us all. So with that, just go out and do some more research. Thank you very much for being such a stimulating.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank you. We have to evacuate within 10 minutes, so the security guys locked up. It's been very nice to see you. We look forward to seeing you at our next.
Thank you for tweeting.